Hi, my name is Scott. I'm from the Economics Tutoring Center, and today we're going to be doing some practice exam problems for macroeconomics. Please make sure to check my notation and language use with your professor because it may vary. The model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply explains the relationship between what? And then we have four options here. So I think the easiest way to look at this question is drawing out the model for aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So if we look at short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand, typically when we draw a graph like this, on the x-axis we have real output, and on the y-axis we have price level. So just from that you can tell that when we do these graphs, when we're modeling aggregate supply and aggregate demand, we're talking about these curves, these lines show a relationship between real GDP and price level. So the correct answer is D for this one. This next question says that if the price level falls, the real value of the dollar, and then either it rises or falls, and that causes people to either buy more or less. So one way to think of this is that say you have $6, this makes a little more sense, and a taco costs $2, then if you divide those you can buy 3 tacos. Now if the price level falls, that would be like, okay, the new price of a taco is $1. If you still have $6, now you can buy 6 tacos. So basically the real value of the dollar tells you how much you can actually buy with it. So when the price level fell from 2 to 1, the real value increased from 3 to 6. So we know the real value rises, the real value of the dollar. And typically if you have more purchasing power, if your dollars are worth more, then you'll tend to buy more. It's sort of like your income increases in some sense. So the correct answer is A for this question. So this question asks what causes the long-run aggregate supply curve to shift to the right. So if you remember the graph, so we have real GDP and price level. We have short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand, and then we have this long-run aggregate supply that it's talking about. And it's asking what needs to happen for this curve to shift to the right like this. So we can look at some of these choices. I mean, let's say, like choice A, let's say price level rises. Price level is just on the y-axis, so if price level rises, I mean, it doesn't move this curve. In fact, in the long run value of real GDP doesn't even change because this line is vertical. So both these choices, A and B, the price level has no effect on long-run aggregate supply. So it has to be something with capital stock. Now, long-run aggregate supply is the natural level of output the economy can produce. So it just sort of makes sense that if capital stock increases, basically workers can be more productive because they have more capital to use, and there are more machines and such to produce goods. So usually an increase in the capital stock will shift long-run aggregate supply to the right. Because a shift to the right, if you'll notice, it means we can produce more output. Like the natural level of real GDP goes up. So this question is answer C. Okay, so this one talks about sticky wage theory of short-run aggregate supply. Basically that just means that in the short run, wages cannot adjust to changes in price level because we just say that factor prices or resource prices are sort of fixed in the short run. Okay, so the sticky wages are sort of what defines the short run. So if you look at, we have real GDP and price level, you'll notice that we always draw this short run aggregate supply upward sloping. And the fact that it's upward sloping means if you look at price level, if price level increases like this, then in the short run, output will increase. And the reason for that is, okay, if wages and other resource prices are sticky or fixed, they can't change, but price level goes up, that means that producers can sell their good for more money, and if they can sell it for more money and they don't have to pay their workers more money, then they're going to produce because it becomes more profitable for them. So this is sort of similar to what the question is asking. It says the quantity of output that firms supply will increase if what happens. So we need the quantity to increase like it did in this drawing I did. And what caused that increase, if you remember, is that this price level went up. So if the price level is higher than expected, that's sort of what it means by the price level going up, then, like we said, the production will become more profitable because of the same reason they can sell it for more and not pay their workers as much. So that's why choice A is correct for this one. Okay, now it mentions an economic expansion caused by a shift in aggregate demand. We have short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Now it tells us that there's a shift in aggregate demand. It doesn't mention right away whether that shift is to the right or to the left. Okay, so we know there's a shift in aggregate demand. The way we decide that is that it tells us that there's an economic expansion. Also, let's just, going back a little, let's say we start in long run equilibrium. So this long run's going through this intersection here. Now an economic expansion means there's an increase in real output. So for that to happen, we need aggregate demand to shift to the right, because now real output went from this point here to this point. So real output increased in the short run, and that's because, like we mentioned before, in the short run wages are fixed, they're sticky, so suppliers will produce more because their production becomes more profitable. But in the long run, these wages can adjust to the higher price level, and so that profitability goes back to where it was before. That's what eventually causes, in the long run, we shift back to this long run equilibrium right here. So the question asks about prices, and it asks what happens to prices in the short run, what happens in the long run. So we have three sort of equilibrium here. This first one is before any shift happens at all. So we'll call that price level 1. In the short run, we shifted here. So we'll call that price level 2. So we see that prices rose in the short run. So we can get rid of choices C and D. And then finally we have the shift back to the long run when wages are able to adjust upward. We'll call that price level 3, and it's even higher than price level 2. So that's, if you look at choice A, it says prices rise even more in the long run. So choice A is correct. Okay, so this question says, which of the following would cause prices and real GDP to rise in the short run? So we'll just draw the short run graph, ignoring the long run aggregate supply. So we have aggregate demand and then short-run aggregate supply, we'll say that this is our initial equilibrium. So we'll call that Y1 for output, price 1 for the price level. Now it tells us what needs to happen for real GDP and prices and real GDP to rise in the short run. So somehow we need to get from this point where we're starting to both a higher output, so we'll call that Y2, and a higher price level, P2. And if you sort of cross these lines, eventually you'll realize that they meet up at an equilibrium somewhere up here. If we only want to shift one curve, so the only way we're going to get from here to here is by shifting aggregate demand to the right. So that's choice C. Okay, this one says in the short run, costs of production increase. So what happens as a result? So we have, again, we can ignore the long run because the question just asks about short run. Now remember, in the short run, we assume that wages and other resource prices are fixed. So if costs of production increase, something in the production process becomes more expensive, suppliers will start to earn less profit because, so we're starting here. We don't say yet that price level changes, so if we stick with the same price level and cost of production increase, then it's less profitable for suppliers. That means that they'll produce less in the short run. So short run aggregate supply shifts to the left, and now we have this new equilibrium. We can see that the price level went up from where it was before, and output went down. So that is choice C. Output falls and prices rise. And then we have this question, which of the following shifts aggregate demand to the left? So with questions like these, I usually like to go through each option. Choice A says the price level rises. And if we look at the same graph as before, notice that on this y-axis we actually plot the price level. So let's say, I don't know, maybe let's say we're here. This is our price level at equilibrium. And as in choice A, let's say the price level rises. Well, nothing actually happened to shift the demand curve. We just kind of moved along this demand curve. So the real GDP might have changed, but the demand itself does not shift. So it's not choice A. If interest rates fall, then, so typically interest rates are connected to investment, and if you recall, you can break aggregate demand into these four components. We have consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. Sometimes that's written XN instead. So like I mentioned, interest rates are going to affect investment spending. The interest rates also affect things like large purchases that consumers make, like cars or mortgages on a home, because typically you might have to take out a loan for that and pay interest on it. So if interest rates fall and we want to look at investment spending, say like a firm trying to invest in a new machine to help production, if interest rates are lower and the firm has to take out a loan to make that purchase, then they will have to pay less interest on it, right? Because they owe the bank less interest because interest rates are lower. So if they have to pay less interest for that new capital, then that usually will cause investment spending to increase, and similarly, consumption will increase for things like cars. And because these are components of aggregate demand will actually shift to the right for this one because it's increasing. And the question asks what shifts it to the left. So we don't want choice B. Now if we look at choice C, it says the dollar depreciates for some reason other than the change in the price level. If the dollar depreciates, that's something that's happening in the foreign exchange market. So that will primarily affect net exports. If the dollar depreciates, then people in the U.S. have less purchasing power, as opposed to maybe, let's say the other country we're looking at is Spain or something. Then the U.S. has less purchasing power relative to Spain, while Spain has more purchasing power. If Spain has more purchasing power, then they might decide to spend more money, and typically, some of that money that they're spending will go towards things they buy from the U.S. So if we're looking at the market for the U.S., then the dollar depreciates. That means foreign countries will have more purchasing power, and they might buy more from the U.S. So net exports will tend to increase. Again, that will shift aggregate demand to the right because net exports are a component of that, and that's not what we want. So choice C is not correct, and of course that leaves choice D. So the reason choice D is correct is, so it says stock prices fall for some reason other than change in price level. That typically has two effects on aggregate demand. So one is that some people are holding onto these stocks and investing in them, and if these stock prices fall, those people lose money, and basically they're losing some income, and that's a decrease in income is something that shifts aggregate demand to the left. The other reason that this shifts demand to the left is that if stock prices fall, that affects people's expectations for the future performance of the economy. So if stock prices fall, people will become less optimistic about the economy. They might invest less, spend less. So if those things are happening, those are parts of aggregate demand. So aggregate demand will decrease, and that's a shift to the left. So that choice D is correct. Okay, so those are the example problems we have today for macro econ. If you have any further questions, just come into the tutoring center or ask your professor.